acronyms are initialisms, but not all initialisms are acronyms. Hi, I'm Layman Pascal, and you're listening to or watching at the Integral Stages author series, where today we sit down with an autobiographical exploration of the big questions in life via a book called Processing Reality, Finding Meaning in Death, Psychedelics, and Sobriety. This is a life story that reads like a list of my favorite things about the 20th century when I was a teenager. LSD and classic science fiction novels, Whitehead and Grof and McKenna and Leary and Watts and Huxley and the Beatles, psychotherapy and humanist peak experiences, neuroscience and the new physics. In the last years of the second millennium, all of that seemed like my inheritance from the previous generation of literate, late modern, white male Anglo shamanoids, which is the category that I'm in. I have some critiques of that stuff, but I have a deep core of profound love and gratitude for the sheer fun and intelligence and provocation of it all. So here to use the process of his personal reality adventure to help us locate the cosmic Christmas tree and to totally grok like what it's all about, man, is a guy who I'm told is great at repressing his feelings, John Buchanan. Hi, John.
Hello, Layman. Very nice to be here with you today. I'm not going to be able to keep up with that level of repartee, but I'll do my best.
I was like, that was the peak. It'll all be downhill from here.
I'm also feeling somewhat over the hill after summarizing the. I didn't know I would ever enter the old white men thing, but I guess I am now.
Yeah, a lot of us end up in that place.
Before we end up in another place, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe for people who are tuning in and have no idea what this book is, you could say a couple of words about how it came to be written.
Sure. I wrote my dissertation basically on Alfred North Whitehead and process philosophy, and Stanislav Grof's transpersonal psychology, and how I thought the two of them create an interesting mixture together of supporting one another and deepening and fleshing out their systems. I'd become particularly interested in some of these deeper philosophical and psychological issues after I started taking LSD back when I was 19, and so bounced around in college looking for a variety of ways of understanding these experiences, both in philosophy and psychology. More psychology at first, but I realized eventually that some of the questions I was looking at were more metaphysical and epistemological in nature. And so I broadened into that. And at Emory, I ran into Alfred North Whitehead and thought, well, that seems to do the best job I found so far. And I'd already found Stanislav Grof's cartography of the psyche, which I had thought was very, very helpful to know that other people were having experiences like I was, and that there was some kind of method in the madness of these experiences. And after as I was just telling you, after numerous attempts to reorganize my dissertation to something that might be more readable, I finally decided perhaps to make it. I was noticing that when I was reading books, what I found most engaged is when people were talking about their own experiences and stories. And so if I worked some of that into my book and made it more of here are the questions that I've encountered in my life, and here are some of the answers that I found most satisfactory, that might be the best approach to it.
There's a kind of skeleton structure around 5 pivotal events. And those might be an interesting way for us to provoke our discussion with each other. So the first pivotal event in your story is your father's death, leading you to a contemplation of, is life safe? Can you trust it?
Yeah, I love the movie Marathon Man, because of the Dustin Hoffman, being questioned by the Nazi dentist, and tortured, and he keeps asking him, "Is it safe?" And he doesn't even know he doesn't even know what he's being asked about. So I think that movie really cuts to the chase of the basic the original dilemma we face on, is it safe? And I think I also mentioned William James's take on that. Is the universe friendly? My father died, well, very suddenly when I was 11 years old. And up to that point, I'd had a really nice life. And that kind of coincided with my older sisters leaving home. And so I went from a rather warm, womb-like experience into this more harsh reality. Not harsh by a lot of people's standards, but in comparison, for me, it felt difficult. And so, yes, that was the first thing, and really got me thinking about things. I've been very interested in science, and I realized the science wasn't going to be very helpful for this situation. And to tell the truth, I was mostly just trying to get by. I was in junior high now and short, not particularly popular. And so, but in the midst of that, I was feeling very what's life about, and how do we get by, and how do I survive? And so the second of the pivotal events was getting drunk at my sister's wedding reception. And although that might sound a bit not all that pivotal, for me, it was like a revelation that I could change. I could feel good. I could change how I feel. And it opened up a bigger question of sort of epistemological in nature. What does it mean if you take alcohol and drugs can really change our perception of the world and ourselves and our feelings about it? How malleable is our psyche, and how malleable is the world itself? And this was amped up to a new level when I took LSD for the first time. And I thought, it was just an astonishing experience. And it really raised a lot of questions about the nature of reality, and what is the, I think I must mention in my book, Fireside Theater, which a lot of us were listening to those days, a comedy album, which was very drug and used a lot of cultural references in very humorous ways. But at one point, they have the students during a principal poops addressing the student assemblies. The people in the audience keep yelling, "What is reality?" as he's giving the usual kind of principal garbage. So that I mentioned, I sort of open up with this experience I had shortly after I started taking LSD, where I was in this apartment we used to hang out and get high in. And as I was just standing there, I suddenly had this sense that psychology, philosophy, and religion were these overlapping spheres of influence. And in the middle of it was this experiential realm that opened up into the heart of what these things were about. And I thought, well, that's what I've got to get into. I've got to find out the religious experience, almost the flowing of philosophical insight, all embedded in some kind of psychological framework. And so that's really what set me off for quite a few years of college, dropping in and out of college. And my first year at college was the fourth event, which was, I would say, my most powerful LSD experience, where I felt as if I was about to get the answer to it all, so to speak. I won't go into the details of it, but I felt like I was approaching this, going through space, and sort of simultaneously going through space and uncovering all of my last egoic habits and flaws, burning those away, and burning away these things blocking this light. And felt like I came very close to it. And this light seemed to have a subjective presence to it also. Now, this was despite the fact I was brought up Presbyterian, or perhaps because I was brought up Presbyterian in the later part of the 20th century, I was not particularly religious. Um, so this was a surprise to think, well, maybe this God thing is actually real. It sounds trite, but it's one thing to sort of think about it, and another to feel like maybe it was there, and I didn't quite get there, and then the final experience thing I mentioned is as the listener might have determined, I was involved in a lot of drinking and drugs, and that eventually caught up with me quite badly, and I ended up going through several treatment centers and getting sober in my early 30s. And so I was faced with how to put all of these things that had been of interest and sort of fallen apart around me, how to put them back together in a way that preserved the best of it and it allowed me to continue exploring what I was interested in. And so I got involved in holotropic breathwork with Stan Grof, training, and have explored things in these ways since then.
Okay, good summary. Lots of points we could delve into. Um, when I think about the question of whether the world is fundamentally safe and friendly, it's an interesting question because there's these moments in your life where you're confronted by this question, but it seems like in that kind of Grofian sense that it's also a question you faced at birth and pre-birth, that there have been these many cycles of facing that kind of anxiety. And I guess what really intrigues me about it is that objectively the answer is no, in a sense. Even though we can go into states of fundamentally feeling supported by reality, it destroys us all. It's not a safe place. And yet, there's a way of being in that condition of hazard and threat whereby we can live as if it's a trustworthy place and that um, we are in a better position to develop and enjoy ourselves and take the meaning from reality if we're able to live as if the universe is trustworthy, even though it obviously isn't.
Yeah, I guess that would depend on what we mean by is it safe and by safe and trustworthy. If you mean nothing bad will ever happen and we'll always feel safe and warm, obviously that's not the case. I was remembering I did a month-long workshop with Jean Houston, I guess in my mid-20s, who was a great source of inspiration because she knew everybody, knew everything, and was wonderful. But we were doing that trust exercise, got in a circle, with one person behind you, and you fall back, and the person catches you. And I did that and fell back, and the guy missed me, and he was kind of kneeling behind me, and I landed my back on the middle of his knee. But we'd also been doing Feldenkrais exercises and yoga and stuff, so I was in pretty good shape. And I thought to myself, well, you may not be able to count on people and trust them all the time, but I'll be okay anyway, which is quite powerful. But yeah, it's also the thing that's sort of how it felt with a psychedelic experience sometimes too. They were terrifying, felt ripped apart, overwhelmed, and just crushed. And yet I come off the other side and have very valuable insights and feel as if it had been worthwhile, which it's easier to be sanguine about these things when I'm feeling relatively good and in a comfortable spot and sitting here talking to you. Less so if I was, say, in Palestine at the moment. So it's I don't think we can. I don't want to minimize at all what you're saying about the question of what how safe. What even do we mean by safe and trustworthy? I'd say a little bit more of that for me, would you?
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there is, on the one hand, there's a layer of experience of reality, like an ontological layer at which everything's okay regardless of what happens. So you're like, it's okay as an experiencer at a deep fundamental level, even though what happens is not objectively going to be okay. In the end, it will objectively not be okay in some respect. On the other hand, there's also the fact that many or most experiences are not experiencing that conjunction of radical okayness and the hazardous outcomes of the world. They're experiencing the world as constantly pressing upon them and disrupting them in ways that never allow them to get to that spot of basic okayness.
Yeah, I think that's unfortunately quite accurate. One of the sad things about being older is that had a good thing to share, and it disappeared in the 10 seconds I was waiting to say it. But um, ontological layer of okayness. Oh well, it'll come back to me, I think. Earlier when I was first mentioning the "is it safe" thing, I was thinking of I believe that's Eric Erickson's first of the 7 stage or challenges that do you remember Eric Erickson at all? The
I
psycho
bumped
is
into a couple of his books when I was a kid, but I wasn't
yeah,
too deeply into it.
he was quite popular when I was doing developmental psychology, and he had this 7 stages of development, and you either you succeeded through the challenge or you didn't, and then that caused problems later on. And the first one was, is it safe? And Grof talks about that the there are several women that he knew and worked with in London who during psychedelic therapy they would hold the patient if they felt that if they wanted it, or the client I should say, if the person was open to it and felt like they needed it. And what he said is that was a that crimes of omission are harder to deal with than crimes of commission. So you can fairly easily perhaps remember bad things that happened to you, but things that you didn't get kinds of love or support to make you feel safe and and that you can trust the world are much more difficult to access and to heal.
Hmm. This a lot of this brings Timothy Leary to my mind. When I was in high school, I met him and Robert Anton Wilson, and I'd been a fan of
Did
their
you?
books. And yeah, and the a lot of that circuit model that they were working on depended upon that first circuit of like biosurvival imprinting. That within that space of a world that is existentially okay at some level and murderous to everyone at the other level, there's a range of different kinds of orientations that an infant can take about the world in terms of how, not is it safe, but is it safe enough for me to take the risk? Is it safe
Mm.
enough for me to be an explorer? And how much of an explorer will I be? Now, I don't know how much later psychology has validated these ideas or not, but it was certainly a big part of their model.
If it was Heinz Kohut, but I know someone had good enough parenting. That nobody's perfect and gives everything you need, but is it good enough to move ahead? Which I think exactly what you're saying. I just read Robert Anton Wilson's the first book in that trilogy that he wrote. What's the title of that? Which is Albert Einstein and James Joyce sitting in a bar together,
Oh yeah, that
talking,
one
and
is
it's
that Masks of the Illuminati? That
yes,
one?
it is, yes, which
Yeah.
is quite an astonishing book, um, and brings up reaches into so many corners. Well, may I ask you what it was like? I never met either of them, so I'm curious about what they were like in person.
Yeah, they were exuberant.
Yeah.
And as a teenager, I hadn't thought about it. I tremendous respect for my parents as beings who kept developing their consciousness, but outside of the house, these were the first two people I thought, oh, I know what an elder is supposed to be now. Like I'd heard the phrase, but it meant something other than just being an old person because I saw these guys. There was sparkle in their eyes. They were excited about ideas and about living and about experimenting. They were very animated. Robert had just returned to the wheelchair. He'd had this, well, I forget which condition it was, polio. He'd had polio when he was a kid, and he'd been cured of polio by a variety of processes, but in his last couple of years of life, he returned to that wheelchair. Leary died about a year after I met him, so they were both in their final moments, really. But they were just so vibrant, in a way that would be called transmission or Shakti or something if we were using Eastern metaphors.
I wish I had met them, and I, Ram Dass was supposed to come to a conference we did at Esalen, but his health didn't permit it. But I saw him one time at an Omega conference, I believe, in New York, and afterwards I just went up to him. There are people in line to see him, and he was in a wheelchair, and just wanted to tell him that I was sorry that he couldn't come to the conference. And that was one of the more astonishing encounters. I know he likes the bhakti yoga of love, but it was pouring out of him in a way I don't think I've ever seen anybody before. Like tears in his eyes, and it's quite amazing to be able to meet these people and feel how they are in the world.
So for me, it was a couple years later. It's when I was at university that I finally had the ability to access something like LSD, and also the books. The university library had the books from the 1960s about these various studies that people had done. These books were not at my local library. So I read exhaustively and then got my hands on this substance and then took heroic doses, partly because Leary had taken a tablespoonful the first time. I had that idea that those were my peers. I'm as good as Timothy Leary. I could take some massive hit and be super prepared. And I remember telling my mom, and she said that she was jealous that she'd taken these things in small doses and very casually just because they were moving around at the time.
Mm.
And I'm curious about your first encounters and how much happenstance or intentionality you brought to those early psychedelic experiences.
Well, as I mentioned in my book, the first time I had an opportunity, well, actually, the first thing I took was some mescaline. And I think the summer after I graduated from high school, a friend had it, and I took it with some trepidation. And just, it was more of a physical experience. I was eating, loving music, loving wordplay. And then, at the end of that, I mentioned that I was driving in the morning back from being downtown and kind of suddenly felt like I don't know how to move my hands, and which seemed like a bad thing, and then got very anxious. And a friend very quickly kind of talked me down. But the next time somebody offered me LSD, and I was too nervous. I was scared of it, and he said, it could be a religious experience, and I poo-pooed this as come on, give me a break. And but I got more curious, and so a friend had gotten some purple acid. I took a year off between high school and college because I didn't even think about applying to college, and so I took this acid, and I imagine it was a fairly high dose because it came on quite strongly, and I had some, but that was the one that just made me like, holy wow, this is something completely new. I had some very interesting visuals, and felt as if my imagination could become the world, as it were, and that's what really got me started on wanting to explore these things. But as I mentioned, for the first few months, and I kept feeling like there was something really opening up, but the people I was doing this with were more seeing it as a party thing. And then I ran into this friend from New Jersey. I lived in Wisconsin, and he's quite a bit hepper and had been into these things longer. And he was into, he turned me on to the to be here now and the psychedelic experience, and I started, becoming much more serious about what these things might unfold and open up to. I When I was at maybe my first or second year at college, I already was worried that I was drinking too much, and I read about that LSD could be used as a way of a large LSD dose could help with alcoholism. And so I got 6 hits of blood and was going to take them all and see what happened, and took 2 and lost the other 4. And the person didn't want to sell me anymore. So that I missed out on that mega dose. Strangely enough, that really powerful experience I had, it was a friend brought down 2 hits of blood or acid that she'd found very powerful. And she and my roommate, I ended up splitting them. So, each had 2/3 of a hit. And that was the most, as I'm sure you're aware, part of the effect of psychedelics is the set and setting. But part of it is the quality and the dosage. And so that combined to create that powerful experience.
When I think back, a lot of what motivated me and a lot of what I was attending to during those experiences was the perception of time. I think I imagined these substances would give me access to a version of myself that stood outside of normal time. I even had sort of very elaborate metaphysical ideas that maybe if I contact that one can contact me in the past, or things like that. I'm curious about any perceptions or observations about the nature of experiential time that you made in those experiences.
Once again, I mentioned there's just, the thing that I think probably everyone who takes psychedelics will notice is that time takes on a very strange quality, the passage of time, that waiting to get off an LSD seems to take forever. And then time seems to be moving very slowly often. So much can happen. And then the next thing you know, it's 12 hours later. So the subjective quality of the passage of time is a major thing. I mentioned in my book one experience where I was trying to I had to go do something else later in the day and mistakenly taken a small piece of a strong dose of LSD. And so I was watching the clock to make sure that I didn't miss this thing I was supposed to do. And so I kept checking, and it was closer and closer to, it'd be 10 minutes, then it'd be 5 minutes, then it'd be 2 minutes. And I started watching the clock, and the second hand slowed down and stopped. And, and I don't know what happened then, except the next thing I was in the kitchen in this state of extreme panic. So I think something actually very interesting happened at that moment. I use that as an introduction in my book to talk about a description I read of the nirvana experience in Daniel Goleman's book, one of his book chapters, where he says, in meditation, one particular kind of meditation, you're paying very close attention to the moment and to the rising and falling of each moment. And as you pay more and more attention, you get more deeper into it and can pay and experience more and more of that. And at a certain point, you become aware of the ending of one moment and the beginning of the next moment. And that he describes as a metaphysical shock of tremendous proportion, and that you jerk out of that almost immediately because it's so overwhelming. And that's, the beginning of opening up to this, to the origins and depths of experience in this particular model. And I feel like I'd be a bit presumptuous to think that that happened to me, but something dramatic happened. I think I thought less about the psychedelics effect on time as on stuff that I hoped I would move into some alternative higher reality was what I was sort of hoping for, which would be filled with knowledge and revelation and who knows what. And some people are against, and apparently I never took the DMT, which seems to rapidly move people into sort of an alternative reality of some sort. And remember reading, who was it? Ralph Metzner in his later writings. It seems to be opposed to that, or thinks that you're losing the importance of psychedelics if you are dissociating. You need to be present in this world. And I don't know. I kind of think, being present here is great, but I wish I'd dissociated a little bit more and explore those dimensions.
Yeah, I only tried DMT once, if we don't count the DMT that's in ayahuasca. It has this vexatious feeling of being suddenly up against another kind of reality altogether.
Mm.
And I went to the Psychedelic Science Conference in Denver last year. It's been years since I took any of these things, and frankly, they're terrifying to me now. But one of the things that really impressed me at the conference was the industrial production of new psychedelics that's going on. Alexander Shulgin and his wife back in the day were tweaking molecules, but now corporations are doing that daily.
Are they
And
really?
there's one approach, which is how do you have the embodied, transformative, developmental, normative use of psychedelics for people in general? And another question is what lies through all these doors, right? People have been pressing into that DMT zone, and they have these elaborate experiments where people are on like drip DMT so they can be in it longer. But if there's dozens, if there's hundreds of new chemicals, one possibility is all the basic avenues of consciousness have been discovered by the intelligence of the biosphere, that it's really smart, and the psychedelics we know about are all the major pathways you could take. The other possibility is the cosmos is really weird, and there's thousands of other doors to thousands of other kinds of states, and we're going to need people who are daring to go through those doors and report back to us.
Yeah, it's I was I was playing golf with a friend of mine. He was telling me about it, and his nephew. His nephew and I were chatting, and this was like 20 years ago. And I was talking about psychedelics with him, and I think he's pre-med. And he started listing all of these drugs that he'd been taking and the different, reactions he'd had to them. I suddenly realized I'd been left in the wake of the psychedelic movement. That was 20 years ago. So it's astonishing. And I've got both of Shulgin's books, but Pikal and Tikal, but I haven't, I haven't read through them, but describing the phenomenology of all these different drugs, of his experiences. I wonder if how these things will help us through the more mundane crises that we're facing. I now see people who are, very very critical of some of the people that I think of as having done great work in getting psychedelics out into the world and into more popular usage and possible legal usage. And I tend to, I also don't want it to be controlled by large corporations and limited to psychiatrists' offices. But I remember when it was all illegal and people going to jail for long periods of time. So I'm still hopeful that that psychedelics cannot be locked up, as it were.
I think the methods of production make a big difference, like, for example, the new ones, but also the laboratory synthesized ones that are more difficult. Those can be locked up, and corporations might be able to pressure governments to favor the ones that are more difficult to make. But at the same time, nobody's going to be able to stop people growing mushrooms. That's going to always get out of control, so to speak. It's an interesting future where I think there is going to be significant legalization and decriminalization, even in places like the United States. And that will be connected to psychiatric trauma treatments and some kind of corporate thing, and also the uh, endless attempts of reasonably affluent people to regenerate their brain cells and enter flow states and be the smarter, better super being they hope they can be. I think there will continue to be an increase in um, quasi-indigenous sacramental usage of various kinds. I think there will be organized attempts to probe the spaces opened up by the new substances. And at the same time, part of me wants to make sure, even though there's no way to make sure of it, that anarchic free range usage is also respected and preserved. Right? So many people have been saying for so many years that, yes, of course, we need to be careful and you have to have the right context. And there's lots of mental conditions where this could be disturbing. But there's also something about that Hunter S. Thompson approach about, what it's like to have a head full of drugs and get on Air Force One. The sort of what does the world we already inhabit look like when viewed through these other lenses? I think we need that, and that comes with a certain element of chaos to it.
That, that that was a lot of what I was doing in my day, so I'm quite sympathetic to that. And I loved the Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. I'm not sure reading it now it holds up quite as well as for a 70-year-old man, but I thought that was brilliant. And I attempted to do Fear and Loathing in the Bahamas with my girlfriend during college, and brought a bunch of stuff over to Nassau and went kind of crazy, and it was it, it was certainly a lot of fun. And what was I? As I was saying before we started, I was looking at your book, your chapter in a book that's coming out soon. It hasn't come out yet, has it?
It's
Men in
right at
One.
the edge. I don't think it's quite out, but it might be, next week, something like that.
And I picked up a book about the non-dual, and I feel like I never quite get my fingers around what people are getting. I mean, I know there's an experience, and sometimes it's more philosophical, and sometimes it's more theological usage, but it seems to cover an awfully large area uh, without, and much of it doesn't seem to be an experiential description of the state. Can you fill me in on all that in 3 minutes or less?
Yeah, there's experiential and philosophical non-duality, and also the word is used very broadly in a lot of diverse ways. I like to pick up on the four-state model that they use in theosophy, and it was taken over by integral theory as well of gross, subtle, causal, and non-dual. And I like to tease apart causal mysticism from non-dual states. And when people say they've experienced oneness, for example, I would consider that to be kind of causal mysticism.
Hmm.
One particular quality a- eternalized, amplified without limit in a way that cancels the multiplicity of everything else. There
Yeah.
is only none, or there is only one. Whereas the non dual experience needs the preservation and transcendence of an oppositionality in order to be described, right? So we say not two instead of saying oneness because
Mhm.
the two are still there. And the difference between the two both applies and does not apply simultaneously. So you need a paradoxical mode of speech to articulate it. And so it's got this element of of utter existential satisfaction, but also of hyper peculiarity, almost absurdity, like it's preposterous for things to both be themselves and not be themselves, that kind of a state.
You remind me of one of the reasons I found Whitehead so intriguing. His at the end of Process and Reality, he has what might be like reminds me of Kant's antinomies. He says it's as true to say that God is in the world as the world is in God. It goes through this whole series of things that would normally be seen as opposing each other, but through his rather unique perspective on how things interrelate, interact, both can be true and both have to be true within that system. And I think it's quite brilliant.
Yeah, my sense is that you can find these states using your different internal intelligence systems, right? So you can, if you have an intellect, you can find the intellectual version. If you have a heart, you can find the feeling version. If you have a body, you can find the body version. If you're lucky, you might get all three at once. But the different detector systems we have reveal different forms of these processes.
A little like the various schools of yoga emphasis.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. I ask you about one other thing. But back in January of last year, February, they were doing some work in my apartment building, so I moved into a house on the lake, and I was going to do some serious writing on a science fiction book, and I got this packet in the mail from the father of an old friend of mine. I'd met him a few times. He was an Episcopal priest, I guess, but had worked in industry and was an electrical engineer and very bright guy. And there's a thing with his sort of theory of the universe, which was interesting. But he also sent me um, various material about the role of plasma in the universe. And I read it and became very intrigued. There's a Whiteheadian physicist, Tim Eastman, who is a plasma physicist. So I was a little bit aware of the importance of this, but I'm becoming more and more intrigued that the plasma makes up the vast majority of the universe. And it seems as if you take in the electromagnetic effects of plasma, that supplementing gravity, that it addresses a lot of the more problematic natures of modern physics. The fixes that they've come up with dark energy and dark matter to account for why gravity doesn't do what it should. Have you done any reading in this area?
Yeah, my sense is that the standard model is both extremely successful for the things we're using it for and widely acknowledged to have some things wrong with it, but we're not sure which things those are. And so there's a set of competing alternatives. And we're not really taking them seriously enough to put them into competition to see which one's going to be the best explanatory model. I'm attracted to plasma cosmology, the idea that the same patterns operate at any scale and that it takes seriously the electrical nature of the cosmos. Those are really powerful. And the discovery not too long ago, really, the sun is not gas, that is plasma. These things should be, I think, setting us on a course to take plasma physics much more seriously. And I think the reason we don't is uh, the experience of human history didn't need to feel anything about plasmas, right? We didn't run into them, so we don't have an intuition about them. Even when you hear the sun is a plasma, what do you do with that information? It means almost nothing to anyone. So it's hard to build up popular and institutional and governmental support for that kind of research. I would put it in a class of alternative physics with some multidimensional gauge models, Stephen Wolfram's attempt to use computation rather than algebra to drive physics forward. There's a number of very interesting approaches going on. And I think one or more basic pieces of the standard model are going to have to be jettisoned before too long. Whether that's dark matter or whether that's Big Bang, something's going to have to give.
When the new photographs of the more detailed and in-depth photographs that have been coming out of the new radio telescope that's been put up into space, when I see these display things they show, it so closely matches the ideas that were being developed in the plasma reading. These strings of galaxies spread along these chains, and anyway, that has gotten me thinking about it again, and thinking, like, just look there, there it is. You can see it. But and of course,
Yeah.
nobody wants to jettison an entire system that's been invested in for 100 years, obviously, and as you say, which parts need to be changed and which are still solid.
I find myself excited by things that seem like they bring biological approaches close to physical cosmological approaches. Wilhelm Reich, and I'm, agnostic about the whole orgone thing, but he made a very interesting point, which is if you don't feel your own experience to be suffused by flows of stimulation, it's very hard for you to have a model of the universe that's suffused by flows of stimulation. But if you do feel tingles, then it makes a lot of sense for your picture of reality to have these streaming electrical organization systems as part of them.
Yeah, that was one of the things that excited me about psychedelics was I could feel the energy moving in my body much more. Well, I don't know if I could feel it at all before, but I could feel that, and the tingling and the rushes, and when you look at charts, the Chinese medicine acupuncture charts of the energy flow patterns, that makes more sense once, as you say, once one has felt it. I love Wilhelm Reich's work. His character. I mean, he had such an important contribution, and the end of his work was, his life was so strange, with the government really, coming after him in an unprecedented way, I think, to shut him down. I'm not quite sure what his sin was, but he committed one, apparently. One thing I love that I read about him in his biography was he would sit up late at night drinking and talking and debating with a friend of his whether Beethoven or Bach was the greater composer. It's an interesting one that they left out Mozart, but one was, I assume, more logical, and the other was more emotional, more rawly emotional.
Yeah, there's a lot I could say, and maybe we could go down that Reich tunnel, but that brings up for me, I'm a big enthusiast about Nietzsche's writings, and it took me a long time to read his writings on Wagner. And in this book he wrote called The Wagner Case, he contrasts Wagner and Bizet, who were two great musical geniuses of the time. He says, look, they're both great musical geniuses, but he's going to make the argument that one of them isn't good for people and the other one is. And it's the first philosophical attempt to bring health into an analysis of music. But it's very much like the Bach and Beethoven dynamic, where he wants to say, like, one is organized, it's coherent, it's precise, and the other is kind of tumultuous and thunderous, and it gives you this sense of emotional potency, but it risks manic depression, it risks nihilism, it sort of thunders around in this neo-romantic sense and never gets its act together to be empowered in the way that the crisp structure is. That was his take on it.
So Wagner is unhealthy. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's interesting. So I would have kind of thought you had been a Wagnerian fan, but
well, he knew Wagner. They were close, and he was very enthusiastic early on. And then, they had personal disagreements and Wagner's work changed, but also Wagner became more popular and Nietzsche was worried about the effect it was having on young Germans. A generation before the Nazi thing, he was saying, this
Right,
is
right.
not really showing up well in them. As Reich would say later, their character structure is not doing well with this form of stimulation.
Just the way rock and roll music was destroying the 60s.
Yeah. I would argue that Nietzsche sort of foresaw the need for rock and roll because when you look at how he describes Bizet, he said this is the sign of what the healthy music could be, and he wants it to be more Dionysian. He says
Of
warmer
course.
and more martial. And when you go martial, you're like, oh, maybe drums. He also says more southern and more African. You're like, okay, black rhythms are going to come in.
Wow.
And when you put it together, you're like, oh, he kind of sounds like he's describing rock and roll.
Yes, that was very anticipatory of him, prescient. I had a good friend at Emory who was what was Nietzsche was his emphasis, and his dissertation was on him. And I still haven't done enough reading in Nietzsche. Nietzsche. He I feel like Trump here. Nietzsche.
Nietzsche.
um, uh, yes. Were you going to go down a rabbit hole with Reich there or something? Was or not a rabbit
Maybe.
hole
Reich
necessarily, but
Reich was one of those guys, Robert Anton Wilson for me, even though I loved Leary's work as a genius and a thinker and a historical character, Robert would tell you who you should know about, right? He would be like, this person and this person, right? I need to know who Aleister Crowley is. I need to know who Gurdjieff is. I need to know who Philip K. Dick is. One of those guys was Reich. And when you hear this idea that it was the last person who had their books publicly burned by the American government, like that's too good to resist.
yeah. The last person may soon change.
Yeah, yeah, that could be revisited.
Yeah, he
I liked, there's a biography of Reich by Robert Corrington, who's an interesting guy. He's a semiotician and an ecstatic naturalist. And he has this forward to the book where he does a really neat kind of antimony take on Reich, where he says, this guy probably was a clinical megalomaniac, but he made radical discoveries in multiple fields of scientific discipline. He probably was clinically paranoid, but international intelligence agencies actually were spying on him and interfering in his work. Like it can be both of these things.
yeah, yeah. It's interesting to picture him advocating for facilities for teenagers to go and have sex, as part of the sexual health of a nation. It's you probably need a Reich to come back here pretty soon.
Well, all that stuff about the emotional plague didn't go away. It's still with us.
That's right. I forgot
And it
his
seemed
term
like
there.
in the end, it seemed like he was pessimistic about treatment modalities, right? That there's some leeway there, but it seemed like at the end of his life, he was putting more focus on how do you prevent children from getting over armored, because there's only so much you can do to unpack the armoring of people who've grown up in that situation.
Yeah. I I've seen, I've done the holotropic breath work, done a lot, done a lot of workshops with a lot of different people, and it's I'm still armored. So not as armored, but it's taking a little psychedelic, you can feel it.
And there's a question about what's wise armoring, and it varies depending on your living circumstance. Um, What's that? This study with the marshmallow where they test the kids' ability to control themselves. If you don't take this marshmallow, you get a second marshmallow in
That's right.
five minutes, and then you like have better life outcomes. So there's another study that was done by a woman, And she showed that a lot of that is based upon the relationship to the scientists, right? So if there's a good rapport between the children and the people doing the experiment, if they trust them, their likelihood of believing they'll bring that second marshmallow goes way up. So then you should exert self-control. But if you don't believe they're going to bring that marshmallow because the evidence is they're not trustworthy, you should eat that first marshmallow. That's sensible in an unstable environment. So unarmoring has to go along with some intelligent use of armoring and understanding how much you need for which kinds of circumstance. How can you put on your armor and take it off and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was thinking about the findings that it doesn't really matter what modality of therapy is used. It's the relationship between the counselor and the client that's the key factor in how therapy will go.
They say that about school as well. Like one of the main predictors of academic success is how well a child forms a rapport with a teacher. If you can't make that connection somehow, then probably your intellectual gifts aren't going to carry you through because you have to be resonant with the system somehow.
Hmm. Did I read that you were brought up in the when I first read it, it sounded like you were in the Western Pacific Island, but I assume that wasn't you were not in Kamchatka, right? You,
No, I was. Do you know Vancouver Island?
I do.
Okay,
Well,
so if you drive almost to the north tip of Vancouver Island, then get on the ferry, and then don't get off at the native reserve island, but go to the next one, almost unpopulated, um, formerly run by a Finnish socialist commune in the 1920s. That's where I was born and grew up.
we had three of the Grof training groups on at Hollyhock on
Oh, on Gabriola.
not. I don't think it's Gabriella's. It's
Is that it? It was up there somewhere at like Ben and Jock's place.
yeah, it's trying to think of the island. I mean, it's one of the larger islands in the middle of that desolation bay.
Yeah.
um, it was a funny, one day we went to hang out at a lake. So there's an island, it had a lake with an island in the middle of it that had a little pond in the middle of it, which I liked. There's this, this, water than land, then water than land, then water than land feel to it. I had I was doing the holotropic breathwork. I was pretty open, and people would decide to swim to this island, and the water was cold, and they went over, and I was kind of hesitant. I thought, oh shit, I'm going to go, and it got about halfway across, and it was a long way, and suddenly I thought this was really stupid to be swimming by myself in cold water, and I started getting anxious, and I thought, now is not a good time to have a panic attack, And so, and my mother made me take endless swimming lessons when I was a kid, forever. And so, I got on my back and was just kind of doing the elementary backstroke and floating around. And somebody came out with an extra float thing, and we went over together. But I've one of the phobias I've now developed is open water phobia. I was snorkeling down in the Galapagos, and I don't know how that happened. So I've not cleaned out everything. There's something very interesting there that's remains to be explored. It has something to do with suffocation. So, with Grof, it was often, went down to birth trauma, which of course then would open to past lives of, all kinds of, hanging or other kinds of trauma. Have you done any holotropic breath work?
Yeah, little bits. We actually we do this meta-modern spirituality retreat thing twice a year in Vermont. And the theme last time was breath work.
Where do
I'd
you
done
do
some in the past,
where
but
do you
we
do
did
that? And
just,
where in Vermont do you do that?
um, what the heck is the name of the town? It's about a half hour, maybe 45 minutes from Burlington. It's at Sky Meadow Lodge,
Oh,
which Brendan
interesting.
Dempsey runs. Yeah. We did. I'm remembering it because holotropic was the one modality we didn't do there, because it can take a while, and you sort of rely on partners and things like that.
Yeah, it is.
But I'd done a little bit of it over the years, not as much as I'd done of more pranayama and conscious circular breathing and that kind of stuff. But a lot of those techniques have very similar mechanisms.
It was interesting to do in the context of a 11-day workshop with, with a consistent group in a sort of isolated spot. I think that enhanced the effectiveness of being able to open up and let go.
Was it Cortez Island?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
Nice,
Yeah,
nice,
there's
nice
another one.
retrieval.
Gabriola has another place on. Gabriola has the Haven, and Cortez has Hollyhock.
That the Haven sounds potentially ominous. The Haven, the Brood. I'm sure it's not, however. Um,
Well, it could be. I had a there was a crew of young guys that studied acupuncture with a doctor in Victoria, and he had come back from Vietnam and studied with these two guys, Ben and Jock, at Haven. And the stuff that came up for him was quite wild and dangerous, and he ended up taking them hostage at one point. So
Whoa,
maybe there is something ominous about it.
wow. Yeah, that's the kind of thing you want to be psychologically prepared for as a counselor. All right, this is just part of the process.
Reich is really intriguing, in lots of different ways, right? And obviously the character armor stuff and the sexual revolution stuff is great, but the orgone stuff fascinates me because of how scientific he claimed to be about it. It's not like he discovered subtle energy. He claimed he could run a motor on it. That's interesting. That there were that there was a new field of physics waiting to be opened there. And it just continues to be intriguing to me because nobody's really followed up on it one way or the other. It still waits as something to be explored or disproven.
A friend of mine at New College built an orgone energy box. I did not try it out, so I can't report on effects. I think he also built a sensory deprivation tank. He wanted to do, I think, a thesis on Reich, and he couldn't find anybody at New College to support him, which is pretty unusual. So, yeah, actually, I'm a little disappointed that nobody was game to go for that because, Reich was one of the most prominent, uh, you know, Freudian disciples, by far, perhaps the most. Sorry, Carl, but uh, there's you probably don't know who Orson Bean is, do you? He was he was some kind of sort of. There was a show. I can't remember if it was To Tell the Truth or What's My Line in the '60s, and it would have these people who had been like on Broadway or were sort of New York fixtures. And Orson Bean was a very funny guy. I love. He'd always have these funny drawings, for his answer. But he has a book called "The Orgone and Me," and I guess he'd been with a Reichian therapist, and it opened it up, and he could see the little orgone energy things popping in the air, and it's kind of a delightful little book, and
Nice. I think I know that title from somewhere. I I think of William Burroughs building one himself and claiming it helped him overcome his heroin addiction.
I never knew he overcame his heroin addiction.
He claimed at one point that he had.
Well, maybe it did. Maybe it did for a while. No, and I didn't know that he yes, built an orgone energy box. What was I was either just reading or watching. Maybe I was watching the the movie what was the name of the movie they made over in Morocco about his time there?
Oh, Naked Lunch?
Yeah, I was watching parts of that and pretty amazing.
When I was a kid, when I got to the end of the seventh grade, we ran out of school. We had like a one building schoolhouse on this island with like
Yeah.
100 kids from kindergarten to grade seven. We got to grade seven and my parents moved, so we went to the big city. And the interesting thing was I could get on the bus and go downtown and go to the movies. So I started to do that. And the first movie I went to see was Naked Lunch, which had just come out. And, Canadian filmmakers, so we were all into that up here. But it was really unexpected. It was like I'm downtown in the city by myself for the first time, and there's just me and two other older dudes in this theater that's otherwise empty watching this very strange film. It was pretty intense.
That is a intense movie to start with. It's kind of all downhill from there.
Yeah.
Imagine it was a really interesting experience. How many people were on that island, population wise?
Well, there was a population sign that said something like 680, but it was probably about half that because the sign was quite out of date. Um, I joke that it was a site of like multiple archaeological layers of failed utopias because there'd been a Christian commune there, and then this socialist mine workers commune, and then sort of hippie back to the landers stacked on each other. But it was very remote, and it was a large island with almost nobody on it.
That's an interesting place to start your life.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, it was felt very secure, and there's a lot of free space to explore, and a lot of people who seemed trustworthy. So you could be a casual investigator and explorer and roam freely, which was very nice.
I feel it's I don't know if a problem or just a sad thing that so many people are not do not have a deep exposure to nature, on a daily basis. And when I see these, I don't know if they're true, but these studies that people don't know where food comes from, don't just, I mean, don't have no connection, in the city to the, to their direct connection to nature, sense of it. And um, on the other hand, people seem to flood into the national parks and love them. So maybe people are feeling the lack.
When I was a kid and we had a big farm, so you would go like a half hour into town, which was the place with a strip of pavement and the store. But the kids from town at school, most of them had never seen a chicken or a cow get killed either. So even in very remote areas, people haven't necessarily had the experiences. I really, I'm happy about it for a couple of different reasons. One is I think that traditional lifestyle is something that allows you to be sympathetic to conservative and rural viewpoints in a more human way that you don't often get if you're raised in urban sort of university towns or the coastal elites or that kind of thing. There's a very straightforward way to understand those people without thinking them as just deplorables. There's something deep about land and the sacredness and the psychological and cultural power of landscape. There's also something about um, the acuity of the nervous system that results from adapting to the complexity of natural patterns. I always sort of cite this study that I saw years ago about a town in Germany where the kids at school had all these hearing and visual tests in 1890s. And so in the 1990s, they redid the test with kids at the same school, and they all significantly underperformed the kids from the 1890s. And the hypothesis of the people doing the study was that they were now exposed to a mostly urban environment where stimuli were simplified. So like a yellow triangle yield sign, as opposed to seeing 30,000 types of green in the forest. So the requirements from your brain are lowered in those environments because we're trying to communicate simply to everybody. But as a result, our ability to perceive is decreased because we don't have to pay attention to complexity and nuance in our surrounding environment.
Mhm. Sounds right. My mother's, some of her family had a farm, and she recounted in somewhat horror of her cousin chopping off the head of a chicken and running around the yard, and that that's different than walking into a grocery store and picking up a package of chicken breasts. You know, it's I try to be a little more aware when I'm starting to eat that an animal has been sacrificed to keep me alive and for my enjoyment.
We had a chicken coop, and I have several horrific memories related to the chicken coop. One of them was my dad cutting the heads off chickens when I was about the size of a chicken, so it's pretty intimidating. And I somehow already had this notion that I expected to see the chicken run around without its head. What I didn't expect was to see the head trying to
All
move
right,
without the body.
all right, you're getting
That
me
was
now.
pretty intense.
Okay. That will probably come back to me if I take psychedelics ever again.
I mean, it's so historically normal that we often don't appreciate how weird it is. Like the farm life to care for animals much more than people normally do, but then also to slaughter them. It's a very strange position to be in.
Have you seen that one of the new people went to New College, ended up as the lawyer for a farmer who was suing, I think, DuPont. Have you seen that film by any chance? I don't know if it's called Dark Waters. And the DuPont was dumping some chemical into the water, and it was killing cows and affecting people, I think in West Virginia. And the scene that was really moving was, the farmer's cows were dying, and he got to know the farmer. At first did not look like a very friendly guy, but he got to know this farmer really well. And the farmer was there with one of the cows that you could clearly see, he really loved this cow, and he was going through all this, problems from the chemicals, and it's very, it's exactly what you're saying. It's a strange relationship, or multi-dimensional relationship.
It also has, for me anyway, it had an interesting sort of set of developmental implications. I didn't think about it this way at the time, but different species of animals and within species, different members of the species strike you differently. Right? Like when you're going to kill a chicken or you have a gun on a cow or a deer, and then you do it with a pig. This was the one that really got me. Was it was like the pig could see what was happening and wanted me to not kill it. And I didn't see that in the face of the cow or the chicken, but I saw it in the face of the pig, right? So there were differences in the sophistication of what you could see them seeing about you. Well, that was really interesting.
I hear that pigs are really smart. Yeah, I know I'm stating something that's obvious to you, but it still amazes me animals being not being viewed as experiencing, feeling beings. It's one of I guess it's a general point, but one thing that John Cobb highlighted that I hadn't really grasped was when Darwin's theories came out. There were two ways to go with the idea that we were part of nature. which was that we would make nature more like us in our theorizing, or make us more like the way we conceived of insentient nature, which unfortunately was the direction we went instead of seeing nature as sentient, all of nature sentient. We sort of made all humans insentient for scientific purposes.
Well, hopefully we'll circle back around and try that other path before the entire system is destroyed.
I think we're making some progress there.
Making some progress. Speaking of Cobb, the I I find certain things in common among the Whiteheadians and process thinkers that I run into. And one is, I think I said this to Matt Segal, it seems like they're trying to smuggle shamanism and witchcraft into philosophy, which I respect. The other is they seem to be an extremely good-humored bunch.
I think that's true. I think it's true. David Griffin, who writes very logically, very serious, had a fabulous sense of humor. It was always very enjoyable to have a dinner with. He was very lighthearted. Um, John Cobb is that way, but I think he's weighted down by his long-term concerns for the future of the world. Um, about when was it? But I mean, I've read a lot and been concerned about the environment and global, all that. But before I went to India with my cousin was a cultural expert on a Smithsonian trip to India, so I wanted to go spend some time with him. And he said I should read the original Limits of Growth book that the MIT systems analysis people did. And I read that on the way over there, and that was devastating to see. I mean, their analysis is, I mean, it may have been, the world did not end in 30 years, but that doesn't mean that, the timing was off. But the interacting, just the way to see these problems are mutually interacting and reinforcing, and how all of the gears need to be adjusted was I can see why he got so excited back in the 70s when he read that, along with his son Cliff Cobb, who's quite a brilliant guy and economist, also turned him on to the issue that the economics is one of the most, maybe the most important gear that needs to be adjusted.
My uncle just retired from being a economics professor for many years.
Yeah.
And when I would hang out with him and the other economics professors, it was kind of obvious they all sort of secretly wanted to be philosophers. But it also seems like economics is one of those high leverage areas that, I mean, it's lovely to do a resonant, powerful linguistic description of multidimensional reality, but we actually have to instantiate new economic models, much more so than we need to instantiate new verbal and descriptive models of reality, it seems.
There's a young woman who I met out last year out in Claremont, who's been posting on Facebook with among the process community, and she's a strong Marxist, and she has some pretty harsh critiques for the Whiteheadians and for the lack of public action or speech about issues in the world. And I wasn't quite sure what to do with it. I don't feel like I have a public voice. I mean, I put out a book, it's an obscure book, but I don't feel that I have a particular position that will influence anybody. So, but it's gotten me thinking.
Yeah, there's really something to, even though I spend a lot of my time on philosophy and spiritual activity, the argument about technology and material infrastructures being the sort of foundational element of change is a really powerful one. But then, like you're saying, other than sort of understanding more about how that works, most people aren't in a position to do much about that. Certainly unlikely that there's going to be a radical economic shift in the global order because a few more people start um, advocating some more sophisticated version of Marxism or something like that, right? So we need to make some kind of economic change, but it has to be an economic change that's actually going to get made and not just one that sounds plausible and exciting and idealistic.
When I try to think through how things might unfold um, with all the problems and interacting, I somewhat depressingly end up with the thought that some catastrophe will be the only thing that will change things significantly, and it probably have to be quite significant and relatively soon before things get so far out of whack that it won't matter anymore. That was my gloomy trip over to India and back, and seeing things in India, going through the slums of New Delhi was didn't help that feeling any.
Well, it takes a lot to dislodge people from their ordinary habits of living, from business as usual, right? Maybe under certain circumstances, religious mobilization can do that. Otherwise, it's usually war and catastrophe. And the problem is, war and catastrophe doesn't necessarily have a good track record in terms of getting positive reorganizations. It might make it worse. Um, so finding a way around that, and at the same time, there's this sort of inexorable series of transformations that come out of the fact that our technologies are different. The sort of Marshall McLuhan argument that regardless of what we might decide about the world, the mere fact that we're using digital appliances is reshaping our brains and therefore reshaping our social moves.
I'm I'm completely sympathetic to people who are raising kids and working jobs that that they're not reading every detailed study on climate change, or are out there advocating for a socialist revolution, because I think people's lives are more and more overwhelmingly occupied with the ongoing vicissitudes of life.
Yeah, and I mean, they can't and they shouldn't have to. It's not everybody's job to handle all of these things. We need experts, we need institutions. Even though I'm in a lot of conversations where the idea of the sort of shamanic shaman versus villager metaphor is thrown around, and there's limits to that metaphor. But part of the idea is not everybody has to be devoted to the life of state change and inner transformation and developmental praxis. They need People need meaning making structures, they need periodic access to transcendental refreshment, they need maturational ordeals and things like that. But by and large, people have different specializations. It's not their responsibility or their proclivity to do all of these things. You need people to hold those spots, but those people have to be competent, mature, reliable, well informed examples. And we don't feel like we're in a situation like that.
No, and even those people there might be people who are like that, don't seem to be in a position to exert much influence.
Hmm.
Is there something we
This
should say
conversation's taken a dark turn.
to cheer up the viewers that are still with us? Well, John Cobb has said, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And he's not optimistic for the reasons we've been talking about, but he's hopeful because he believes that the God will help us will lead us to make the best of what can be made, of what happens. And as you know, from the Whiteheadian point of view, God's primordial nature is and consequent nature continuously feeding in lures towards creation of maximum value. Although one of the things I do like about Whitehead's idea is that what God seeks is intensity of experience. So I don't know if I put it in my book, but LSD then becomes quite a sacrament, because it's I think a premier intensifier of experience.
Yeah, I think that's very close. The idea of intensity of affect is very close to what Nietzsche was trying to say with the will to power, which was not a sort of reductionist idea of people manipulating each other in political power. It was the idea that every part of reality is motivated by this impulse to access empowerment conditions by overcoming themselves. So I think that given that the total system trends in that direction, but then the time frame thing is an issue, right? I'm probably very optimistic about the next 300 years, but am I optimistic about the next 30 years? It, yeah.
It will
Plus,
be
everybody's going to die anyway.
it will be interesting times, as they say.
Yeah.
White in one of White, if I'm remembering correctly, in one of Whitehead, a book of, it might have been The Will to Power of Nietzsche, and he had a little side note in it where he's talking about will to power, and he said, this is what I'm talking about with I think with apprehension. I can't remember the correlation he makes, but I would not have immediately thought Whitehead would be into Nietzsche, but apparently he thought he was onto something very important.
I think Whitehead is one of those people who tried to absorb all of the great philosophers into his system.
Did you know Bertrand Russell said that he was the most well-read person he ever knew? He said he
Yeah,
was,
that makes
in
sense.
his autobiography, he said he was mentioning some kind of thing he'd written about Bohemian silver mines and some kind of thing in an obscure journal, and Whitehead had read it already.
I got into Whitehead um, in many ways for the same reasons I got into Nietzsche or Heidegger or Gurdjieff. I love a long, complicated sentence, a strange, right? If you read Process and Reality or even Adventure of Ideas, you're like, it's very almost paragraph long, strange articulations where the person has to invent their own words to try to get this thing across. And there's something so triumphant and fascinating and challenging and symphonic about that to me that I liked saying his sentences aloud was the first thing that excited me about Whitehead.
And he's not even German. Have you read much of Colin Wilson's work?
I was a huge Colin Wilson fan when I was a kid. Colin Wilson and Robert Anton Wilson. It always caught me that they had the same name and they worked at about the same time and they covered many of the same people. I've actually recently been rereading a bunch of Colin's stuff in terms of his attempt to think out the dynamics of the intentional production of peak experiences, I think is still largely unsurpassed.
I love his fiction, but in certain point, I was surprised to discover that he really was his solution to the angst and anxiety and meaning and ennui of the 50s and 60s was basically what I had thought. His was Maslow and Whitehead. He has these essays. I don't know if you probably haven't seen this book. It's called is it called The Tip of the Iceberg? And it's a collection of essays, and one is about Whitehead and how both Maslow and Whitehead are the problem is that we aren't going deep enough. We become shallow, and that's why we're bored and find meaning, because it's the meaning is deeper and needs to be uncovered. And I invited him to a conference on Whitehead and psychology, and he and his wife came, and he was delightful. He was, and he said he was he was one of the angry young men, along with, I can't think of the playwright's name, who wrote Look Back in Anger. He said it's ironic because he was never angry at all. He was really quite a happy, pleasant guy. But I really, I love his fictional presentation of his ideas, and I love that's why I love Stapleton. I like the idea of expressing philosophical ideas through through the mode of fiction, and not even bothering with some of the window dressing of fiction. The characters are okay, and you mention you're in Scotland, but let's get to the ideas.
Yeah, there's a beautiful thing about that. And, Wilson, I love his almost complete indifference to genre, right? That he's going to write a book about philosophy, and his next book is about murderers, and his next book is about
Yeah.
giant spiders in the future, and it's always the same thing. There's giant spiders, so anyway, here's why you have to use intentionality to evoke peak experiences. And the next one's, here's murderers operate like this. They use intentionality to evoke peak experiences. It's the same message, just from one format to another. It's beautiful.
There's vampires on a comet coming at us, but yeah, that's funny. That's funny. He also has an essay about French postmodernism, where he said, it took him like I forget if he's reading Derrida, maybe. He said it took him like a year or two to finally begin to understand the language. And then he realized they weren't saying anything new. It was just all this complicated way of saying it, which may be a bit harsh. But I enjoyed reading it anyway, because I find myself baffled at reading a lot of it, and I've got great friends who love the stuff, so I know I just need to bear down, but I'm not going to.
There's a lot of really fascinating things there, and the mental exercise that it elicits in us in terms of intercontextual deconstruction of reality is really a powerful and beautiful thing. And yet, from Colin's perspective, or from a lot of other perspectives, the absence of what it is that empowers a human being and brings multiple perspectives together into coherence, it just isn't there in most of them. They open up a space, but we have to populate that space with intensity of affect.
Could you write that all down and email it to me, and I'll start out my next book with that. That's a perfect summary of much more beautifully articulated than I could have ever done of how I think about it, or how I wish I think about it.
I'll see what I can do. I think this is, for the sake of people watching and listening, we're going to have to bring this conversation to an end. We've putatively touched on your book, but I think this is really maybe Layman and John get to know each other, chapter 1.
I've enjoyed it terrifically. Oliver had said I should meet you, and when we get in touch, and he was exactly right. It's been a great pleasure to talk with you, and love to do it again whenever it's good for you.
All right, I'll reach out with something around that. Nice to meet you, John.
Thank you very much.